All right, it sounds good. It's good to have you here this morning. This is kind of short notice. I was supposed to do a training last week, um, and I got a new computer and I could not get the technology to work. I still am struggling to get a scanner and one of my printers to hook up, but it's working. So hopefully that'll take care of it pretty soon. I'm Pam Knox. I'm the director of the Weather Network and the agricultural climatologist. And if you're in extension, you know I send these pesky announcements out every once in a while about impending weather, just to help you get ready. And so I am going to go ahead and start talking about both a review of the last year's growing season and the outlook for next year. So about half of my talk is on last year, and the second half is on this coming growing season. And let's see if I can get there we go. This is I spend my life looking at graphs, and so some of you may be used to looking at graphs, others not so much. This is called a thermograph. A thermograph has a lot of information on it. This one happens to be for Albany. I put this together for a talk I did for corn growers earlier in the year, and this is for 2024. And you can see on there's a band of green. That's the average high and low temperature for each day of the year. And then there's the red on top. That's the extreme highs for each of those dates. And the blues is the extreme lows for each of those dates. And superimposed on top of that is the gray bars, which represent the actual temperatures for each day in 2024 in Albany. A lot of variability. There's a lot to look at here. We could talk about this for a long time. What I really want to point out for Albany, the growing season for this year is from the date of the last frost in spring until the date of the first frost in fall. And for Albany last year, the last frost was on February 21, and the first frost was on November 30. So that's the length of the growing season. And if you look at this, you can see January was relatively cool last year. We had a warm spell right at the end of January that really got some of the flowers blooming. It didn't last too long, so it wasn't too much of an issue. And so we have a lot of up and down variability really through March. That's when we're in the pattern where we're getting fronts come through. And then after that, it settles down into a pattern that doesn't vary as much from day to day. That's the summer. The summer has a lot of high pressure. There's not a lot of fronts that come through. And then that changes again as we go into the fall. Late September is usually a point where we start to change that. We see there's quite a few days in September there where it was fairly cloudy and cool. We went through a cold spell in mid-October. Didn't quite get down to freezing, at least not at Albany. And then we went into another warm spell at the end of the fall and back into the regular scheme of ups and downs of temperature as we have gone through. So I'm gonna put my websites in case you want to look at it for your own area. And I will provide slides later for anybody who might want this. I'm also recording it. Hopefully that will work and you'll be able to look at that as well. The growing season over time in the US has increased, especially since 1970. And that is something that is due to warming of the whole Earth system, not just the US, but the whole globe from global warming. And so you see there's some years that go up and some years that go down. It's a problem for farmers because they would like more consistency. But overall, it is increasing over time due to the warming temperatures. That gives some opportunities for farmers because they can grow different varieties that take a little bit longer to mature, or they can do more double cropping. So it's not all a bad thing. It's just something that has to be adjusted to. For the last growing season, and here I just picked May through October as sort of the representative, you can see that the county average temperature anomalies for the summer was a little bit warmer than normal for most of the eastern half of the United States. Florida was a little bit warmer. The Northeast was also a little bit warmer, and my home state of Michigan as well. But generally not too much warmer than normal, just about a degree or so. Precipitation for the summer or for the growing season was relatively wet. And if you look at that, you kind of wonder, because I know there were a lot of dry periods as well. This just takes an average of the whole summer or the whole growing season, and that includes the hurricanes, Debbie and Helene and Florence if you're in um, Alabama, and Milton if you're in Florida, and some of the not even named storms that hit the Carolinas this past year. So it's a little bit deceptive to look at these long-term anomalies because they just lump all the precip together. And of course, when you get 12 inches in a day, most of it does not get into the ground. Most of it just runs off and causes flooding. Degree days over the summer were relatively a little warmer than the last few years. This is just from Watkinsville, which is where my office is. And it's the monthly growing degree days base 50 from our website for Watkinsville for the last 4 years, just for comparison. And you can see that 2024 was a little bit above all the other past few years. So it's a little bit warmer than usual, and that showed up in the growing degree days for April through November. I think the only month that wasn't true, it was October. And so October 2021 was a little bit warmer. That was a drought year. So not a surprise, but not a huge difference from other years. Just overall, just a little bit more. But the accumulated value, since every month was the highest, was a little bit higher. You probably saw that if you're looking at corn growth or cotton growth or something like that. It was growing a little bit faster than it might have otherwise. Precipitation to me was one of the most interesting things about this summer, this past summer. Yeah, I just broke it out by months here. Not always the best way to do it, but it worked out pretty well this time. This year was really like a windshield wiper summer. Some months were very wet, some months were very dry, and even the very wet months were often wet because of single events like a tropical cyclone or a hurricane. So April, you can see, was relatively wet in the southern part of the state, and the northern part of the state was drier. That caused some problems for people that were trying to get into the fields to plant because it was so wet that the machinery was getting bogged down. So they had to worry about that a little bit. May was even wetter, and that was really almost the whole state. So again, certainly some delays in planting and difficulty getting into the ground. I think some farmers actually had to switch from, say, cotton to peanuts, or from corn to peanuts, because they just could not get the corn in the ground fast enough. And so that was something that had to be done. We get to June, and June was dry across the state. There was very little going on. So that gave farmers a chance to catch up. But of course, those seeds need moisture to be able to germinate and grow. And so I think even though there was a lot of planting that had gone on, they were a little bit slow to catch up with that. So that also affected plant corn pollination in some areas because they have higher moisture needs during the pollination season. And so there was a little bit of yield loss, I think, from that. If we go on to the second half of the summer, you can see on the bottom, July was a fairly wet month. There were no tropical storms during that month, but we still did have quite a bit of rain that month. August, you can see the very big difference between the southeast, which was where Hurricane Debbie, or then Tropical Storm Debbie as it went over Georgia, hit, and the rest of the state, which was quite dry. But remember, Debbie happened over just a couple of days. And so most of that rain fell in just a couple of days, and the rest of the month was dry. So there was this long dry spell from really the beginning of August until Helene came in later in September. And you can see September was relatively wet overall. A lot of the dark green in the map for September was actually part of the Helene rainfall. And again, the Helene mostly affected things in the eastern half of the state, but there were some other events that also brought some rain in as well. If you see little bullseyes, that may be just an individual station that had, got hit by a thunderstorm cell or something that just happened to show up in the database. But you can see overall, went from relatively dry conditions in August to wetter conditions in September. And one of the problems with having those wet conditions in July was we had a lot of big increases in fungal diseases. People had to really treat for that, and slower growth because with the rain comes also lack of sunshine as we get more clouds as that moisture evaporates. August, we had a lot of problems with drought increasing in the northwestern part of the state, and there were a lot of issues for people that were growing forage for their livestock. And so that was more of an issue. If we look at drought overall, drought you can see this is a timeline for that shows the percent of Georgia that's covered by different categories of drought. And the darker the color, the worse the drought is. Now, I came to Georgia in 2001, and I was hired because of drought, because the state climatologist at the time, David Stooksbury, was trying to get tenure, and he was so busy answering the phone, he couldn't get any work done. So they hired me to come, and I've been here ever since, although I have never picked up a Georgia accent for some reason. And you can see we've had some pretty big droughts in Georgia over time. When I came, the drought actually started in 1998, but they weren't creating this timeline yet. So that one kind of lasted through 2003. We had a few wet years that also had some tropical activity. And then 2007 to 2009 was a big drought, especially in North Georgia. They were talking about Atlanta running out of water, and Athens, our reservoir was down 14 feet. So we were probably within 30 to 40 days of running out of water ourselves before the rain finally came back towards the end of November. You can see it was pretty severe. I think Governor Perdue had a prayer day for rain on a day that was carefully picked so that rain would actually occur. Politicians never do that, but it was very convenient for him. And then we went back into another dry spell for a couple years. The next drought from 2011 to 2013 actually hit the middle and southern parts of the state. And it was actually a bigger drought, but it didn't get nearly as much media attention because Atlanta was not running out of water. And so since that time, we've had one fairly big drought. This is the one in 2016 to 2017, started in, I think, May of 2016 up in the northwest part of the state, where they had a 3-week dry spell just when corn was pollinating. And they lost their whole crop in just about a week because everything was too dry for the pollen to stick to the silk. The drought was lower in intensity across Georgia until the fall, and the fall was really warm again and caused the grape growers were happy because they like dry weather because it concentrates the sugar in the grapes. But overall, that was a little bit of a problem. Hydrology, a lot of streams were at record lows, even going into spring of 2017 before we finally got rains in about April, and that helped wipe out that drought. Since that time, we really haven't had any big droughts. We've had a couple of short-term droughts in the fall of 2019 and the fall of 2023, but we really haven't had much since then. I keep waiting because sooner or later we're going to get another one. I don't know if this is going to be the year or not. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Definitely, we're seeing in the last few weeks, drought is expanding again. Of course, right now, everything is blooming and the plants are growing and they're pulling whatever soil moisture there was out. And so we don't really have a lot of reservoir for a dry spell if we would get one. Let me talk for just a minute about the impact of tropical storms and hurricanes. This is a map of all the tropical storms and hurricanes that occurred in 2024. And you can see we had a couple of direct hits by Debbie in the early parts of August, and then Helene at the end of September. We did have some impacts from some of the other ones as well, but those are really the two big. And I was really surprised because many years, Georgia does not have a single direct hit from a tropical storm or hurricane. So it was very surprising to me that we had two this year. And so it was definitely an active season. It was neutral conditions for most of the year, as we will be going into this coming year. And I'll talk about that more in a minute as well. So I think we had about 18 named storms. There was one other storm that was called Potential Tropical Cyclone 8 that hit southeast North Carolina and caused a lot of problems there for hog farms and sweet potatoes, but did not really affect us. The rain just did not get far enough in to affect us, but certainly affected other parts of the southeast. And then you can see the track of Milton crossing the Florida Peninsula, which caused a lot of problems for the citrus growers down there and the vegetable growers as well. But really the two main storms for us here in Georgia were Debbie and Helene. And we also got just a little bit of rain from the remains of Raphael, which had dissipated before it got to Georgia, but still had all that rain and moisture associated with it. So it's been an active year, and that is something that we'll have to look again at this coming year. Here's a map that shows the rainfall from Hurricane Debbie. You can see it's really concentrated in the southeastern part of the state. There are some areas there. It's hard to read the numbers, I know, but you can probably see some over 13 inches in some places. And that caused a tremendous hardship for the farmers there. Some places had a couple of acres of peanuts that were just completely wiped out. For most farmers, it was more of a rain event than a wind event. The exception to that is the tobacco crop. So I talked to Jay Michael, and he said that they really were just about ready to harvest, and the winds from Debbie, even though they weren't a hurricane force anymore, were still strong enough to really shred those leaves. They lost a lot of their value because they were so wind tossed, and so they lost about 75% of the tobacco crop. It's not a huge production for Georgia, but it is a very high value crop, and so that was really a blow to the farmers that grow that. In Florida, where it was still a hurricane, their losses are up to 263.2 million. And a lot of the plants were so wind beaten, they didn't know if they'd be able to recover from that or not. And so that was something that they were kind of watching, and they probably downgraded those numbers just a little bit later. So a lot of rain from that, some trees down, because when you have that much rain, any wind is going to blow trees over. And we saw that certainly again later with Helene. So most years we would expect one storm, maybe Debbie or something like that. But this year, Helene was really even a bigger story. And unfortunately for our Georgia farmers, a lot of the attention for Helene was in western North Carolina, where they had the tremendous flooding. And of course, the topography there is very steep, so a lot of houses got washed away and so on. But the farmers in southeast Georgia were really badly hurt by Helene, and they really didn't get a whole lot of attention from that. The Hurricane Center just issued their final report on Helene. If you're interested in that, you can go to the National Hurricane Center, nhc.noaa.gov, and look under the Tropical Storm archived reports and see what it looks like. I think I also put a link to it in my blog. There'll be a blog link at the end. This is a map that shows where Helene's hurricane winds were supposed to be. On the smaller map on the left there shows a forecast from the National Hurricane Center where the hurricane force winds were expected to be based on the best forecast they had going in at the time. And then you can see where the power outages were in Helene on the bigger map on the right, and just some of the different crops that are grown in that area, or different agricultural products that are produced in that area, including a lot of poultry and eggs. I put this on here because if you have ever looked into having hurricane insurance, and it's called, USDA calls it HIP-WI, Hurricane Insurance Program, WI for wind. It's based on the small map on the left-hand side, basically. It's not based on actual observations. It turns out that the strongest winds in Helene were to the right of where the Hurricane Center said they were expected to be. And so people that lived along the coast were often not eligible because the Hurricane Center's initial analysis of that said the winds there were not the strong enough. They probably weren't quite up to hurricane force, but they were certainly tropical storm force. But you can see the tremendous amount of damage there. Some counties had thousands, over 1,000 power poles knocked down. And I think I've talked to a few people who said they were without power for several weeks. And some of you probably have your own stories about that. And so it caused a lot of problems. The initial estimates for Hurricane Helene for loss to agriculture were about 6.6 billion, but they did cut that back to about 5.6 billion later, as some of the crops were able to grow out of that damage, or they had better estimates of what was actually lost. But that includes both lost crops, lost livestock and timber, infrastructure, and replacing equipment and trees, including a lot of pecan trees. And so, they lost about a third of the cotton crop, which was just about ready to be harvested. A lot of it was already defoliated. And so it was very vulnerable to those winds that blew from Hurricane Helene. And I think there were over 400 chicken houses that were damaged and over 200 that were completely destroyed. And the Florida producers said the losses were worse from Helene than they were for Adalia for peanuts and livestock. You can see on the bottom left there is a picture of a pecan grove. I know our research center in Midville lost almost their entire pecan grove. So just tremendous amounts of damage from Helene on agriculture. Of course, that doesn't even count all the other problems with power outages and damage to buildings and damage to roads and bridges from the flooding rain. And so that's really a huge issue. The total number of deaths, and I think including North Carolina, were about 250. And I think that number is still somewhat fluid. So let's talk a little bit about how tropical storms can affect the drought. This is just a blow up of that map I did earlier. It's just now for 2023 through today's date, or the last date that one was listed, which is yesterday. You can see that fall drought was severe, but very short term in 2023. 2024, we did have quite a bit of low level dryness, but every time it started to ramp up, we had a storm like Debbie that came in and pushed the area that was covered by drought in Georgia down. Happened again with Helene, and it happened again to a lesser extent with the remains of Raphael. So if we had not had those storms, we would have probably gone into one of those really big droughts. About 30% of Georgia's summer rain comes from tropical systems, so we need that rain. We just don't really want the winds, and we don't want 12 inches in a day either. So that, the rain can be beneficial, and that's one of our main sources of rainfall in the summer, along with some of the daytime thunderstorms that we get. Not too many fronts come through Georgia in the summer. Every once in a while we get one, and that will bring some rain often, but it's not a major source of rain for us. So we had these storms, but the storms came in, they dropped 12 inches in a day. Most of it ran off or pooled in low-lying areas. What ran off just, all went into the streams and didn't get into the soil moisture. The rain that fell and pooled in low-lying areas suffocated the roots of plants. So farmers had to be careful and harvest around those areas with the poor stands, because they didn't want to mix that with their higher quality crops. And so, I really think we would have probably seen one of the big droughts like we have in previous years if we had not had those tropical storms. So if we look at 2024, this is just sort of a summary of that. The precipitation was all over the place. It was like a windshield wiper. One month was high, next month was low, and we went back to high again. It's a real problem for crops because, of course, crops need maybe an inch and a half a week, depending on what their growth stage is. And so when you go through those periods, especially farmers that are doing rain-fed agriculture and they don't have irrigation, were really impacted by that. And the overall pattern this year was really dominated by those tropical cyclones. Temperatures in general were a little warmer than average. We had a little higher rate of accumulation of degree days, but it wasn't hugely warmer than average, especially even in the months that were really dry, it wasn't too bad. Drought expanded when we didn't have tropical activity for a while. Right now, we're seeing drought expanding as well. Again, we'll talk about that a bit. Multiple hurricanes brought devastation to the southeast as a whole, and getting hit twice in the same season. You just recovered from one storm, and you got your power back. You're starting to get everything back, and then to get hit again, it's just tragic for some of those farmers. Because they're already economically very limited. And so I know there's at least some farmers that are still paying off loans from Hurricane Michael back in 2018. So just a really devastating situation for farmers in the most impacted areas. A lot of different crops were affected during the growing season by one storm or the other. And of course, the livestock were also affected by these storms. Even though it's not in the growing season, I did want to at least mention the January 2025 snowstorm. You can see that it covered a lot of the southern part of the state, and some places it was a lot of snow, up to, I think the highest I saw was 9 inches in Cordele. More generally, I think 8 is what's mostly accepted in most parts of the area. That whole band that went across the southern part of the state. Here in Athens, I think we only got there were two snowstorms in January this year. One was in early January. In Athens, we got about an inch and a half from that. And then with this storm later in January, Athens only got about half an inch. We didn't get much. But the incredible amounts were down to the south. And I think I sent out an email that said you need to prepare for this if you were having some kind of meeting where people are going to have to drive in. And several of those meetings were rescheduled, including the corn short course, because they just didn't want people to have to drive through this. Most people in the south cannot drive in the snow, and you wouldn't want to because there's really no snow plows, and there's a lot of hilly terrain, especially in North Georgia, but even in South Georgia, there's still river valleys that you have to deal with. There's a lot of losses from this agriculturally, mostly to nursery growers because they had these shade structures that were up and they just could not handle the amount of weight of the snow. There was the water content of the snow wasn't huge. It was very fluffy snow, but it was still heavy enough to collapse these shade structures. And of course, anything that was underneath them was destroyed for the most part.
No, that's Mr. Pelt and Austin.
So so that was really an issue. Some of those producers said they had more damage from the snowstorm than they did from the hurricanes. So one of the big climatological things that we've been looking at for the last few weeks is La Nina. And the map or the graph on the left shows what it was predicted in September of 2024, and we kept saying La Nina's coming, La Nina's coming, La Nina's coming, and it didn't get here. It wasn't officially declared until early January. So all fall we were in neutral conditions.
Tim Daly, sorry, Mr. Calls on another line.
So that was a problem for people who were expecting our La Nina situation to be warmer and drier than usual over the course of the winter. And that was something we kept waiting to see. And it was delayed. And when it finally did occur in early January, it's a very weak La Nina. That means southern Georgia is more likely to see impacts from La Nina than northern Georgia is. Very typical for a weak La Nina. And sure enough, as we got into later in January and into February, it started to take on a more typical pattern for La Nina. And so then most of the snow and the rain and everything was up in the Ohio River Valley, as we expect with a weak La Nina. So the latest forecast now is here on the right-hand side, the little bigger graph, and it shows we're still technically in a La Nina, but they're expecting it to switch over within the next month back to neutral conditions. And that is expected to stay through the summer and by the fall. Sometimes we swing to El Nino. They don't think that that's going to happen this year. They think we're going to go back to another La Nina for next winter, which means we have another shot at warmer and drier conditions than usual next winter. Of course, this is the time of year when these forecasts aren't very good, so we'll just have to wait and see. But right now we're expecting to be in neutral conditions in the summer. And if you don't know what El Nino and La Nina are, you can certainly look that up, or I can talk to you about it offline later. I've talked about it enough. I think most people know what it is. Right now, it's very weak. It's probably going to only last for another month or so at the most, and we'll go back to neutral conditions. Neutral conditions have the biggest impact on us in summer in terms of how it affects the tropical season. We have neutral conditions. The tropical season tends to be more active, and the very earliest forecasts for the tropical storm season that are coming out now, none of the official ones yet, but some of the unofficial ones are coming out, and they're expecting to see another year similar to last year in terms of the number. Of course, that doesn't mean anything about where they're going to go. So this is a picture of where the cold ocean temperatures were. This is a very strange La Nina because the coldest water, this is the blue area in the central Pacific Ocean, was displaced farther to the west than it usually is. And you can see warm water on the eastern part of the equator there in the right center part of that diagram. This was for January. And so that shifts the whole pattern of atmospheric waves around the globe and probably contributed to the cold weather that we had in January. We don't know exactly why that was. Every La Nina and El Nino are a little bit different. And so that's just the way that it's set up this year. Another thing that I've gotten a lot of questions about is why was it so cold in January? You know, we have something that's called the polar vortex. The polar vortex is really a ring of air that's high up in the atmosphere. So it's not at the ground, it's high up in the atmosphere. But underneath that high ring, that's where the coldest air tends to be stuck. So if you have a very tight ring that's located right around the North Pole, then most of that cold air is contained up near the poles, and we don't see that much of it. But if we have a weaker ring, so it's more spread out, you get these waves that, you know, ripples in that. And if you get caught under the cold side of one of those ripples, you can have cold air, and that's what we had this year. So it's very wavy. Some people think that in the future we're going to have more of these wavy patterns in the winter because it is partly driven by the temperature difference between the equator and the poles are warming up faster than the equator is because it's losing sea ice, it's losing snowfall, which usually reflects sunlight back to space. And keeps things cool there. So we may see more of that in the winter. It's a real discussion in the climatological community. They don't all agree on this yet, but certainly it's something that we saw this year. And so if you look at January 2025 overall, the Southeast is this big mass of blue, which means it's colder than normal. But if you look almost everywhere else in the globe, it was much warmer than normal in January. In fact, January for the globe as a whole was a record-setting warm January. So we were just like the lucky winners or lucky losers, I don't know, unlucky losers for getting this cold air, but it's not typical of what was going on in the rest of the globe. And next time it could be that Europe will be cold and we'll be hot. And because these lobes, it's really not very predictable. You might remember a couple of years ago, Texas was under this really cold weather, and they had a lot of problems with heat and you know, loss of electricity. And so that was a real problem for them. This year it was shifted a little farther to the east, but everyone is different. And so we were in the anomaly in January of this year. Otherwise, we would have been much warmer and we would have had a much more typical La Nina winter. So where are we now? This is for the last 90 days. Departure from normal temperature is on the left-hand side. And it shows that since pretty much the end of December, we've been a little cooler than average overall. Not really what we expect with a La Nina, but that's because we had that cold outbreak and that really cold January, including some pretty deep frost and freezes then, as well as the snow. But there's a lot of the Southeast that was still warmer than average, just not most of the state of Georgia. We look at the percent of normal precipitation on the right-hand side. You can see that the dry winter is just exactly what we got. A lot of the rain was farther off to the north in the Ohio River Valley. They had some snowstorms with that as well. And so even though we did have the snowfall, we didn't have a lot of other precipitation over the winter. There's just that small band there in northern Florida, mostly from one or two storms, I think. But a very typical pattern for a La Nina that we were dry across most of Georgia. And that is a problem because when we have a La Nina winter and it's dry, it means we have no reserves of soil moisture going into the next growing season. We're already there. Everything is growing now and the plants are using whatever water we have. So this is the latest drought monitor map that came out yesterday, and it shows that there's dry conditions over a fair amount of the state. Keep in mind that they look at 3 months or longer. The drought monitor will never capture flash drought. And I'm sure Lisa and I could talk about this because the forage community has insurance, but they're much more dependent on short-term flash drought. And that just never shows up on the drought monitor map, even though the insurance is tied to the drought monitor. So it's a continuing thorn in the side of forage producers. But you can see, I mean, the Augusta area there is just really dry. And if you look at the soil moisture map on the bottom right there, you can see there's a lot of dry conditions, especially across the southern part of the state. And you can see how dry it is around Augusta. So it's not a surprise that they have a severe drought there. But there's other areas of the state that really aren't showing that. And I think they're probably there's really a little bit reflecting the fact that we did have that rain from Helene in the late September, and that's still within 6 months. So it's kind of showing up on some of their indicators. And so that is something. But we'll have to watch this carefully. There's not going to be a lot of rain this week. I think the next chance of rain is this weekend. There's a chance of severe weather, but I think the rain's going to be pretty scattered. So I'm not sure we're going to get any widespread relief, although there could be some locally. We look at the planting temperatures. This is a morning temperature. If you took this map from the Weather Network in the afternoon, the temperatures would be quite a bit higher. So this is reflecting more of the morning lower temperatures, which at least in Athens, we're still in the 40s for the last few days. If it's above 50 degrees consistently, you can plant corn. And in fact, most corn, I think, has already been planted, except in areas maybe where it's really dry and they're worried about germination. But it's not quite up to a daily average temperature of 65 yet. So I think probably people are holding off a little bit on peanuts and some of those other crops for crops that like the warmer soil temperatures. Things are going to gradually warm up this week because it's going to be sunny and warm. It's supposed to get up to 80 here today in Athens. I'm sure it'll be a lot hotter than that in South Georgia. So that will really bring those temperatures up. So planting should be going apace, I would say. Where are we now? This is a really poorly done thermograph because the software I was using for the thermograph earlier in the talk was not working until about half an hour ago, and I just didn't have time to update this. You can see that relatively cold, this is for Macon because it's in the middle of the state, relatively cold temperatures through January, included that really cold spell around the third week. That was when we had the snowstorm. And then almost a complete switch when we got to late in January into early February. It was very warm. Things started to come out of dormancy a little bit. I was worried about that. We went back into colder temperatures, and we did have more frost late in February. Fortunately, I don't think it hurt most of the fruit crops too bad because I don't think most of them had quite come out of dormancy yet, but it was somewhat of a concern. Since then, we've been relatively warmer. You can see that the rainfall for Macon down on the bottom there, they're well below normal, and they have been every month for this year so far. So they're already quite dry. So that's something that we're just really going to watch carefully because we're going into the season now where whatever rain falls is going to immediately be used by the plant. So if we have a dry spell, there are no reserves in a lot of the fields. So if we look at early February, as I pointed out, the pattern shifted to a more typical weak La Nina pattern, and it's been that way for most of the spring. We do expect that to continue in April. You can see here warmer and drier is likely in southern Georgia and down into Florida, a little bit less likely in northern Georgia. And that's because we never quite know where that line between the wetter areas and the colder areas is going to be. Southern Georgia certainly has higher statistical relationships with here. So for April, we expect that to continue. And even if La Nina isn't even here officially anymore at that point, there's still some lingering effects. For the early part of the growing season, this is April, May, June, temperatures on the left are expected to be warmer than usual. They don't really have a good feel for what's going to happen as far as precipitation goes because they don't know at that point how strong the La Nina will be. I should point out that when you look at these seasonal temperature outlooks, this shows the probability of above and below normal. It doesn't show how bad it's going to be. It just shows the likelihood that you're going to either be above or below normal or near normal. Every temperature map is going to start to show a bigger likelihood of warmer than normal temperatures than cooler than normal temperatures, unless the signal is really obvious. And that's because we're on a rising temperature trend. All the months of the year are getting warmer. And so if the trend is upwards, you're more likely to get another year that's above normal than below normal. So you're going to see that a lot in these maps. If we look later in the summer, this is July, August, and September, see that continuation of warmer than normal conditions across the whole country. They do show us now in the southeast with an above normal chance of rainfall. I think that's because they expect another tropical season. And so that is likely driving the above normal rainfall that we're seeing here for later in the fall. Of course, hurricane season really officially starts June 1 and goes through November 30, but the peak of it is mid-August through mid-October. So I've had a few questions about whether or not we'll get a late freeze. Some people like to use Easter as a way to decide when it's time to plant things, especially here in North Georgia. Easter is late this year, so it's not going to come until well into April. The map on the left-hand side shows the probability at 1 in 10 years we'll have a frost on that date or later. So we're in late March right now. That's the royal blue. You can see a lot of South Georgia is still has a 1 in 10 chance of getting a late frost. Other northern parts of Georgia are much more likely, of course, as you'd expect, because the mountains especially get frost much later than the rest of the country does. But I did look out at the long-range models through April 11, and I don't really see any signs of frost, except for maybe the far northeast mountains. And if you look at the map on the right, that's the count of the number of days that the temperature has been 32 and below since the beginning of March. And you can see that almost the southern half of Georgia has not had any frost in this month so far. So they may be already out of the frost season for this year. I don't really see anything coming, but we still have a small chance that it could. Tropical season, as I mentioned, the ocean temperatures, ocean anomalies are on the left-hand side in that big map there. And you can see how warm the Atlantic Ocean is already and the Gulf of Mexico. There's a few areas that aren't. But that's the area that we're going to be looking for development of tropical storms once we get into the May and June period. And if we have warmer than normal temperatures, then that's more likely to facilitate the development of these storms. Usually the early ones and late ones form in the Gulf or nearby, and the later ones are the more typical ones. You think of the waves coming off of Africa. That happens more in the August through October period. So we since it's going to be a neutral El Nino this year, and so we're going to probably see another active season. We don't know where they're going to go. There are a couple of forecasts I've seen online where they're starting to talk about places that are more likely to be hit, but they're basically using climatology and saying the Outer Banks of North Carolina, which get hit a lot anyway. Florida is more likely to get hit. So I wouldn't put too much weight in those at this time. But I would say it's going to be an active season, so it's good to get your preparations done ahead of time. And this warmer than usual Atlantic and Gulf is something we've really seen a lot in the last couple of years. So we'll just see if that continues again. Some people are linking it to a change in the formulation of the diesel fuel that ships use. And they've cleaned it up a lot, which means the atmosphere is more transparent and more sunlight can get to the surface and warm things up. So we're really watching that carefully. I also wanted to just say a word about wildfires. I was up in Asheville this past weekend and looked at, as we were driving home, we saw a lot of these plumes from the forest fires that are occurring in North Carolina and in South Carolina. You can see on the satellite or the model on the bottom right, there's some plumes from several forest fires that have formed, including one in Rabun County. And then yesterday, there's a plume, wind was blowing in a different direction, so the plume was covering most of the northern part of South Carolina. If you think hard, you might think back to the fall of 2016. We had all these forest fires up in North Carolina. Gatlinburg was almost ablaze. So if we do continue to see dry conditions for the next few months, that is a possibility. The wildfire potential outlook on the top left there shows that really the whole Southeast is expected to be susceptible to wildfires in the next few months. I think if you look all the way to May, it concentrates it more along the coastal regions and not as much in the mountains. And there's a map from fire.airnow.gov which shows you where all the fires are occurring. A lot of the ones down in southern Alabama are controlled burns that farmers are just using to clear out some of the weeds and vegetation or clear their fields out. And so this is a combination of the wildfires that we're seeing up in North Carolina and South Carolina, and the controlled burns that are happening in some agricultural areas. So since we have good weather, it's a good time for you to take a walk around your property. Make sure that you don't have any fuel there that can really help the fire spread. And if you're in an area that got hit by Debbie or Helene, there's probably a lot of downed trees. And so you want to, and that's fuel as they dry out. That is going to be a big problem. They have already said that some of these fires in North Carolina are in the areas where they had a lot of tree fall from Helene. And so that is something that you have to keep in mind. And whatever you can do ahead of time to prevent fire damage to your property, now is a great time to do it. It's also a great time to do your inventories for in case there's a hurricane and you have to claim crop insurance or home insurance for that. So here's the bottom line. I know we're getting close to the top of the hour. The growing season's already begun across the whole state. Plants are using up all the available soil moisture there is. So if we don't get more rain, the drought's going to get worse. Most corn has already been planted due to the warm soils, and the farmers are starting on other crops now, although, soil moisture is an issue. Northern Georgia is going to be less affected by La Nina in the coming weeks and months as it really sort of dissipates. And so we're not going to see necessarily that pattern continue over the whole summer, but at least for the first half of the growing season, we can expect drier conditions in South Georgia than North Georgia. And then I think we're more likely to see a drought this summer because we don't have any soil moisture built up in our bank account unless we get some tropical moisture come through. And of course, it's still early if we could get some frontal rain, as we will this weekend. I just don't know how much we're going to get. And then finally, another active tropical season is expected, but we don't know where those storms are going to go. So you just have to plan generally for what that is going to do, and then watch as they start to develop and the Hurricane Center puts out their cones, and then you can start to think about more specific things that you have to plan for, or you have to start doing once the storm is actually there. So that's all I have this morning, and here's my contact information. I'll leave it up here. If any of you have any questions, now is a great time to ask, and otherwise I'll let you go back and do the important stuff. I don't see any questions in the chat, just a few people that have introduced themselves, which is great. Nice to have a bunch of people here. And I think I've successfully recorded this, so it may be that people will be able to access that later. Appreciate your all coming. Hope that the Weather Network has been of use to you. You can get it either by going to georgiaweather.net or to weather.uga.edu. Either of those will work. You can call me on my office phone or email me if you need to, if you've got any additional questions. I tend to do most of my social media posting on Facebook through my own account, just because I have a lot of friends who are meteorologists, and so I share things that they put out. I don't do a whole lot on Twitter anymore. I've started to use Blue Sky, but I don't use it for a lot. So probably Facebook. I'm old. So Facebook is my social media of choice. And if you're interested in more, you're certainly welcome to sign up for my blog on the case. The website is there listed in the gray, site.extension.uga.edu/climate. All right, I don't see any more questions, so I'm going to go ahead and end this. And again, I appreciate your coming, and hopefully we will get this sent out to everybody. I will try to make the slides also available once I get my act together. So thank you again, and have a great day.